So tomorrow I'm going to a gig that a friend of mine is playing at, and I've wanted to get better at doing video recordings of live gigs. So I thought I'd take the opportunity to try out a few different lenses, a few different camera angles. The primary camera is going to be a Nikon D3300. The second camera I'm going to use the GoPro. Here is my collection of lenses. I have a telephoto lens, Sigma prime lens, so this is good for low light. I've got some macro extension tubes, and then I've got this ridiculous thing. There's 2 wide angle adapters and 2 macro adapters connected together. What this does is it gives ridiculous barrel distortion. The idea behind the macro tubes is I have a telephoto lens, which would be pretty useless in a live setting, but I'll be combining those with the macro tubes, and then with combining these two, I'll be able to get ridiculous super close up. All right, and that's it. That's all my lenses.
Live video or did that
So it's now been a few days after the gig, and I've had some time to master the audio and have a look at the footage. I've done a lot of video recording and editing before, but I usually shoot on a tripod. So the goal of the night was to test how I could use the handheld footage to add some elements of movement. There were 4 sets on the night, so after I mastered all of the audio, compiled and color graded all of the footage, I did some side-by-side comparisons. So here's how the night went. Before the first act started, I took some vanity shots of the equipment with a wide aperture lens. This was so I could use it later in editing. I had also planned on using a macro telephoto lens for this too, but the narrow aperture of the telephoto didn't let in enough light, so the footage was unusable. The first act was Corpse Paint Express. For the first act, I recorded handheld with a narrow focus lens. There's quite a bit of shake in the footage, and I wanted to make it seem a bit more chaotic by shooting handheld, but after looking at the footage, I think it's a little bit distracting. The narrow field of view didn't help either, as it makes the camera shake even more obvious. I had 2 ideas of how to fix this in post-processing. My first idea was to hide the shakiness with digital image stabilization, but in doing so, I lost a little bit too much quality because the software needs to crop into the image to stabilize it, and it warps the image in a way that I don't like. My next idea was to embrace the shake and make it even more stark and vivid. So I took all the color out, increased the contrast, and boosted the noise levels to extreme. It's a really gritty effect, but I think it looks great. Despite the shakiness, I liked the angles and the framing. But this was only made possible since the venue was big enough for me to get a distance away from the performers. If there were more people around, or the venue was smaller, or there were too many people, then this shot wouldn't have worked, which means that this shot is highly situational. The next act was Die Like a God. For this act, I tried using a wide angle distorted lens, but since I was standing too far away and not moving around, it didn't really get the effect that I wanted. The handheld footage didn't really suit because the subject was too stationary. I feel like having multiple tripod shots and maybe a detailed shot of the synth would have worked better in this scenario. It could have looked better if I moved closer and moved around a bit, but since I didn't know the artist and I didn't want to block the view of the crowd, I had to stay back, and the footage probably suffered as a result. The next act was Muddy Lawrence. For this act I used a handheld gimbal stabilizer with a GoPro and set my main camera on a tripod to give myself editing options later. I found that having a second camera was great for being able to make the edit much more interesting. The only problem was that the GoPro was awful in low light, so the footage was too soft and the colours were awful. This is another place where rendering the footage in black and white could help hide some of these quality issues. But the better solution would be to use a better camera or to bring my own lights to light up the scene a bit better. The last act was Donkey Mothers of Us and Paul Kidney. I'm friends with both of these performers, so I was allowed to get up really close with a wide angle lens and get some really crazy shots. Another friend of mine, Jules, was recording as well, and I also had a GoPro on a tripod, so that gave me in total 3 different angles. This time around, using the wide angle lens worked really well. Getting up close and moving around made the camera shots come to life, especially since the performers were thrashing about. Having a second shooter when doing handheld footage worked incredibly well, since it enabled me to go from one frantic shot to the next without needing to fall back to a stationary wide shot and ruin the momentum of the edit. What I learned from this little test was that the movement of the camera seems to be best matched to the level of movement of the performer. A narrow field of view looks good for stationary subjects, but might be hard to replicate because of how crowded venues can be and also the size of the venue. It may not always be appropriate to run around in front of the stage filming, so the shots may need to change constantly to suit whatever's happening inside the venue. Having more cameras to swap between when editing made a much bigger difference to the end result than I expected. And lastly, the lighting was inadequate to get any decent footage, so in future I'd like to bring my own lights. Since looking at this footage, I've brought a second good camera and I've modified some lights to give myself better lighting options to get better quality video. I hope you've enjoyed seeing me experiment with camera setups for gig recording. I'm still trying to figure all of this stuff out for myself, so please leave comments if you have any ideas or criticism. That's everything I wanted to say for today, so thanks for watching.